First on our agenda this evening is a presentation from the Charter Schools Office highlighting the changes that they have made to the administrative procedures to Policy 401, Charter Schools Authorizing Functions. At this time, I'd like to ask Christina Grant, the chief of the Charter Schools Office, to come forward and make a brief presentation. To clarify before the presentation, there is no action necessary from the board related to the changes, as these are being made to the administrative procedures for Policy 401. And we have asked the Charter Schools Office to present this information at today's committee as an opportunity to highlight this important information at a public meeting. Thank you, Ms. Grant. Please begin your presentation.
Thank you, Dr. McColgan, and good evening, board members. Tracy, thank you. Good evening again, Christina Grant, Charter Schools Office. We wanted to take this opportunity this evening to give an update on the renewal process and also frame out a recommendation to the administrative procedures under Policy 401 that we would like to explore for this year's group of schools and next year's group of schools. We're here today to discuss administrative procedures under Policy 401, specifically the changes that would impact the Charter Schools Office's ability to have renewal recommendations as a part of the renewal evaluation process. This is a summary of where we are to date. We kicked off our process last year in April of 2020, and we've been steadily going through our process of evaluation, which finds us here today, where we are just at the stage where we would begin making recommendations for the schools that are up for renewal this year, which would lead to action by this Board of Education starting at the May meeting and occurring again in July and onward until we have decisions made for schools that are up for renewal this year. Next slide, please. As an overview, we wanted to quickly review the domains of the Charter School Performance Framework, the areas that we look at when we are evaluating a school in terms of being able to make a recommendation about their renewal. First, we look at academic success. We ask questions like, is the school outperforming the district or similar schools in terms of proficiency, attendance, and post-secondary outcomes? Is the school meeting the growth standard for all students and for those which have historically underperformed? We look at organizational compliance and viability, looking at, has the school created an environment that is accessible and fair to students of all background and needs? Are the school's policies in compliance with applicable laws? And does the school institute practices that are in compliance with its own policies and applicable laws? Last but certainly not least, we look at the financial health and sustainability of a school. Is the school an effective and responsible steward of public dollars? And does the school engage in appropriate financial management practices? Next slide. When we think about the Charter School Performance Framework and our guides for renewal recommendations, we usually are organized into three domains. Again, academic, organizational, and finance. For each domain, schools receive a rating of meets standard, approaches standard, or does not meet standard. If a school receives a does not meet standard rating in any domain, the school may be considered for a non-renewal recommendation. We wanted to take a second and frame out what our process traditionally looks like as we engage in the conversation that we're presenting to the board this evening. Next slide, please. Given the realities of COVID-19, there are several constraints that we wanted to bring to the board's attention. The pandemic has affected our evaluation in the several ways, and we wanted to frame those out this evening. With respect to academic success, in a typical year, we would have 4 years of academic data to use and evaluate for a standard 5-year charter term. The 2020-2021's Pssa and Keystones have not been given for 2019 and 20, and our data is limited to the first 3 years of the charter term. 2018-19 is the last year of data that we have. With respect to mission and educational, that plan and category, in a typical year, we would conduct in-person renewal site visits to establish a rating. For this year, the renewal site visits did not occur, so there is no rating. The CSO is redesigning this category for future cohorts. With respect to financial management, In a typical year, the Office of Auditing Services would conduct in-person financial reviews and a special education file review of all renewal schools and issue findings regarding financial management, including enrollment audits. This year, OAS has not concluded and finalized all of its reviews in the renewal cohort, so there will be no ratings within the financial management category. The domain ratings we will have this year will be based on financial health only. Next slide, please, sorry. Given all of that, we are proposing an adjustment for COVID-19 as it impacts the renewal decisions that we would make. The board, through Policy 401, has directed the CSO to use the Charter School Performance Framework to evaluate performance during the charter term when a school applies for renewal. The pandemic has significantly impacted school operations and the availability of data. These circumstances necessitate an adjustment to the CSO's approach to renewal recommendations for the 2020-21 and 2021-22 renewal cohorts. Through modifications to the administrative procedures under Policy 401, the CSO may take into account the impact of COVID-19 on charter school data availability when making renewal recommendations solely for the 2020-21 and 2021-22 renewal cohorts. And it will look as follows. Next slide, please. For schools that were to receive a 5-year recommendation with or without conditions, we will be making recommendations that would hold the same. The school would receive a 5-year renewal recommendation with or without conditions. Next part, Tracy. For schools that would have received a 1-year renewal with conditions that may have included a surrender, we will be exploring a 5-year renewal with surrender conditions that would be reviewed and reported on by the CSO at year 3 and year 5 of the 5-year renewal term. For schools that would have either faced surrender this year or received a non-renewal recommendation, we will be exploring a 5-year renewal term with annual surrender conditions. And we also potentially will still explore a surrender or non-renewal. We wanted to frame out the different types of recommendations that the CSO will be making as we seek to apply this COVID-19 modification. Next slide. The impact of changes are that the schools will still be held accountable. We're making these changes because all schools are working through a once-in-a-lifetime event that has disrupted all facets of public education. The magnitude of the operational impacts on schools and the learning impacts on students are yet to be fully understood. The CSO feels that our proposed approach is the only reasonable approach given the context. Will we still use the Charter School Performance Framework? Yes. All schools will still be held to rigorous standards, and the CSO will continue to publish annual charter evaluations for every school. How can the public learn more about the CSO's evaluation for the 2020-21 renewal cohort? With the updated approach in place, the CSO will be finalizing renewal recommendation reports. ACE renewals will be published, and they will be on our website in the coming weeks. I think that that's the last slide, Tracy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Grant. And I don't know, again, we don't have any action on this, but I wanted to see if anyone had any clarifying questions before we move on to our review of the policies. Ms. Fix-Lopez, I see your hand up. Is that for?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify 2 things. One, you said, is it possible to bring the slides back up, or if we can bring those back up? There was the part where you had talked about that this would apply to the 2021-2022 renewal cohorts. Can you bring that slide up? I just want to make sure I had that right. So first, I want to make sure I understand which cohorts you're recommending that it applies to. Yeah, right before that, I think.
Yep.
Okay.
It will apply to the schools that are up for renewal this year and schools that are up for renewal next year.
So if I were in renewal cohort 22, 23, right? If I were in that and I come though, what happens then? Because we're still missing 2 years of data.
We would have to reevaluate and see where we are at that time.
Okay.
At this point, PDE has issued guidance on administering PSSA data, and we are hopeful that we will be in the process of re-administering all assessments that would allow us to have data that would allow us to run the traditional process of the implementation of the charter school performance framework.
So so I just want to clarify that we're not giving charter schools the opportunity for the next window. If you think about, cohorts out 4, 5, 6 years that there's lack of data for these 2 years. This is applying just to these 2 years of cohorts.
That is correct.
Okay. And then my other clarification question was, and I think it's 2 slides forward, where you talk about the 3, like what it is now, the strict versus COVID-19. Yeah, this one. Can you go the whole way down to the bottom? Okay. So I understand you're saying, like, right now, if your recommendation in a normal world would be 5-year renewal, it will still be 5-year renewal. If your recommendation in a normal world were 1 year, it would be 5-year, but we're going to look at them at 2 times instead of waiting until the end of the 5 years. Is that right?
That is
so
correct.
Meaning in year 3, like let's say they were issued the renewal at 5 years with a surrender clause and certain conditions. At year 3, if they hadn't been met, then they could be asked to surrender.
That is correct.
Okay. And then the last one for the red part at the bottom, if you were recommending a surrender in normal world, what you would recommend in COVID world is they get a 5-year renewal, but every single year they be essentially reviewed to see if they've met those conditions and could potentially surrender.
That is correct.
So if you were in the red school and you got that 5-year renewal, that means that there's 5 potential points within that 5 years that you'll be reviewed to look at potential surrender.
Surrender or condition. So there may be, each year may just have conditions. The first year may have conditions with the surrender clause. The second year may have conditions. Essentially, we are calling out that every single year there will be conditions, and we will be reporting back to the board on where the school stands with respect to those conditions. And depending on the compliance to the condition or not, it could trigger the surrender of the charter at any point over the next 5 years.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Joyce, do you have a question on that same thing? Because I was going to ask
Yes.
a clarifying question on that.
Yeah, on this, can
Go
you go
ahead.
back to that slide?
Yeah, keep that slide up, please.
So on the red slide under impact of COVID-19, it says 5-year renewal with annual surrender. Is it surrender or conditions?
It will be surrender. There will be a surrender clause attached to the entire 5-year term.
Right.
And will be conditions set for each year. Depending on the level of the condition, we may have a school that has a surrender clause each year. They may have a surrender clause that kicks in at years 2, 3, 4, or 5. We aren't at a position yet to actually tell you what the recommendation is for each school.
And
so
then,
we tried to frame it out as broad as possible.
okay. And then what help me understand, what are the kinds of things if we're not concerned about, if we don't have the academic information? You said that we would be evaluating schools under financial health.
Mm-hmm. So the timely submission of audits, any findings that we would find through the charter school office's review, statements of financial interest of board members, security clearances of staff members that are serving students, overall governance concerns around stable boards, reporting of board minutes and activities, all of the other areas of overview and oversight that we have for our schools. There are some schools that are up for renewal this year that have conditions and surrender clauses already attached to them. And so we're stepping back and seeing which should roll over, which conditions should change, and we will report them out as we make a recommendation for the school when they finally are up for renewal.
Okay, but we just won't see any academic. Okay, I get it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then each one of these will come back to the board for a decision, as would any charter renewal decision.
That is correct.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Danzy?
Yeah, on the red again, I'm reading this as that under the strict framework could be surrender or non-renewal. Under the impact of COVID, I'm looking at it as there are two options: 5-year renewal with annual surrender condition, or we could just say surrender non-renewal. Is that?
That is correct.
Okay, thanks.
And I think that kind of ties into my question, because it's the red that I'm concerned about as well. If these are schools, and I get that we don't want to add more trauma, we want to get kids back in schools in person as soon as possible. So I get that we want to do something, but I'm just a little concerned about, that it's a 5-year renewal, even with those clauses. And I'm not sure, I don't understand why we're not doing just like a 1-year renewal so that we fully reevaluate it next year.
The challenge with a 1-year renewal is it does not allow us to still have enough issuance of the standardized assessments to give us enough data. We would find ourselves a year from now recommending another 1-year renewal. We know that it will take at least 2 years of assessments to be run in traditional fashion to collect data to then apply the academic performance side of the framework, so we could compare school performance to district schools, similar schools, and look at overall growth of schools. And so that is why we are attempting to avoid the 1-year recommendation.
And then if you truly see something very egregious in those schools, we're not going to go down that pathway, I hope. I mean, because the slide is making it seem like everybody's kind of getting a pass this year.
Oh no, it's going to be a lot more oversight for all of the schools. And the Board of Education always has the right to revoke a charter in the event that something truly egregious occurred during any time of a charter's timeline. We haven't found ourselves there in quite some time, but we are working to ensure that we're going to do our due diligence of oversight while we navigate ourselves out of the global pandemic.
Right. So this it's not sort of like an automatic that the schools in this cohort are going to go down that path. We'll still be doing an evaluation this year to determine if they're going to stay on that track.
And so when you see schools that are up for renewal next year, you will also hear us report back on how the schools that have annual conditions and surrender clauses, we will also be reporting back on how those schools are doing at the same time.
And what if a school doesn't agree to the surrender clauses that we would otherwise be non-renewing? Then
we
what?
will cross that road when we get to it.
Okay, Ms. Ahia Hinton.
Just as a point, Ms. Grant, just as a point of clarification, for the same slide that we don't have to pull the slide up, but for the same slide, the difference between the second intervention versus the third is that they would be monitored at the 3 and 5 year plan versus an annual review. That's what the difference
we have certain
is.
Schools that, we have certain schools that if tests were running, we'd be making very different decisions.
Okay.
We want to avoid giving them a 1-year recommendation because we'll find ourselves putting those schools up for renewal again next year. And so instead, we want to do a 5-year recommendation and then do a step back at year 3 and a step back at year 5, because again, 2 years of testing data will allow us to make different recommendations.
So then that means that, I know you guys are always monitoring and assessing, but then this means that this increases the level of vigilance, I would think. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, next year is going to be a busy year. We have 23 schools up for renewal next year, and we have 13 schools up for renewal this year.
All right.
And Ms. Sally?
Thank you and good afternoon. Just a quick question, Ms. Grant. I'm wondering if you've had the opportunity to look at what other charter school systems are doing as a result of the pandemic and how they are evaluating, and if there's specific best practices that you've been able to incorporate into this policy based on, I'm going to say, quote, your peer group across the country. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Sally. And yes, we've stepped back with the National Association of Charter School Authorizers and our peer authorizers both within PA and across the tri-state area. And, you know, the limits of our law are the limits of our law. Other jurisdictions have 1 year, 2 year, 4 year renewals. Their authorizers can apply very different processes. For us, we've taken that guidance, and that is essentially where we came up with the concept of a 5-year renewal with specific conditions and then surrenders tied at different points. It's the best way to apply a practice that would get us enough academic data and then also acknowledge the limitations of our law, and then also acknowledge that we want to be able to hold schools accountable as we navigate ourselves forward. And so we actually have stepped back and touched base with lots of other authorizers. And it is, to your point, a challenge that many authorizers are facing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. I don't see any other hands raised. So we are going to move forward to the review of our policies